No church would take her because she'd been in a brothel. A deacon married her. The Bible is still on the table, where I left it 8 years ago. I don't open it anymore. I don't have a reason to explain that, it's just how it went. There are things in a man's life that he can't square with what he believed about himself, and when he can't square them, he either finds a way to pretend they didn't happen or he sets the book down and walks away from the table. I walked away. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to lie to you about it either, because lying about it is exactly what started all the trouble. My name is Caleb Pryor. I was a deacon in the First Methodist congregation of Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory for 11 years. I was a man the town looked to. That is not me bragging, it's me telling you what I lost, so you understand what I'm talking about when I say a woman who had nothing put it back together for me. A woman no one in that town would have crossed the street to spit on, if they're being honest. I'm going to tell you how it happened. I'm going to tell you all of it. It's going to take a while. There was a mind. That's where it starts, so that's where I'll start. A man named Cyrus Fewett came through Harlan Creek in the spring of 1887 with a mule, a pack saddle, and a story about a silver vein in the Oscura Mountains that would make every man who staked in rich for the rest of his life. He had a sample. I saw it, a chunk of ore the color of a storm cloud, dense and cold in the hand, with a seam of white running through it like a scar. A surveyor from Santa Fe had written him a letter. The letter said the formation was consistent with significant deposit. That's what it said. Consistent with. I was 42 years old and I had $160 in a coffee tin under my bed. My wife Alina had died the winter before, consumption, and my daughter Nora had gone to live with Alina's sister in Albuquerque because I couldn't look after her properly and I knew it, but that knowing didn't sit easy. I was a deacon with a cold house and a tin of money that wasn't going to grow on its own. I staked in. 6 men staked in total. Myself, Walt Cribbs, who ran the feed store, 2 brothers named Aldous and Pete Fenn, a Mexican freighter called Reyes whose last name I never learned right, and Cyrus Fewett himself, who put in a quarter stake for acting as the locator. We signed papers at the Assier's office in Cruces and rode out to the Oscuras in May when the passes were clear. I want to tell you I had doubts. I want to say I prayed on it and heard something cautionary. But I didn't. I was just a man with a tin of money and a cold house and a loneliness in me that silver seemed like it might fix, which is the oldest and stupidest reason a man has ever done a stupid thing. The vein was real. That's the worst part of the story, that the vein was real. The first 3 weeks we pulled ore that made Aldous Fenn weep right there in the shaft with rock dust on his face. Reyes built a sluice. Walt started keeping tally in a little book he carried in his breast pocket. At night we sat around the fire and talked about what we were going to do with it. Walt wanted to expand the feed store. Aldous was going to buy out his father-in-law's cattle operation. Pete wanted to go to San Francisco. Reyes didn't say what he wanted, and I respected him for that. I didn't know what I wanted. That was the first sign that something was wrong with me, and I didn't read it. The vein thinned in the 6th week. We went deeper. It thinned more. By July it was gone, pinched out in a seam of granite, just gone, like it had never been there at all. We had enough ore on the surface to split 6 ways and come out about $400 apiece above what we'd put in. Not nothing, but not what we'd been talking about at night, not what had made Aldous cry. Cyrus Fewett wanted to go deeper. He said the vein had to run further, had to bend, had to come back. He said the surveyor's letter said significant. He said he'd personally guarantee it. I believed him. I don't know why I believed him. I believed him because I wanted to, which is the same reason I'd believed him the first time. That's the truth of it. We put in another 2 months, 40 feet deeper. The granite didn't break. The vein didn't come back. By September, 4 of the 6 men had less money than when they started. Reyes had spent his savings on the sluice materials. Walt Cribbs had mortgaged the feed store on the strength of what we'd find. I had nothing left in the tin. Cyrus Fewett left on a Tuesday morning before anyone else was awake. Just the mule tracks in the dust heading south. He left a note that said he was sorry, that he'd believed the vein would come back, that he wished us better luck than he'd had. Pete Fenn used the note to start the cook fire. None of us said anything. We rode back to Harlan Creek in October. The town knew. That's the thing about a small town, it already knows. It just waits for you to come back and confirm it. I rode in on a Thursday, trail filthy, broke, with a horse that needed shoes I couldn't afford. Walt Cribbs had ridden ahead the day before. And by the time I tied up at the livery stable, the whole story was through the streets. I had given money to a swindler. I had done it twice. I had preached tithing and stewardship from that pulpit for 11 years, and I had been cleaned out by a man with a rock sample and a second-hand letter. That's what people were saying. I know because Aldous Fenn told me. He was not unkind about it. He just thought I should know. The congregation didn't come to me formally. There was no deacons' meeting, no official word. What happened was quieter and worse than that. The pastor, Reverend Ellis, came to my house one evening and sat down at my kitchen table and said he thought I might want to step back from my duties for a while. He said people were unsettled. He said stewardship was a matter of example. He didn't say I'd disgraced myself, but his meaning was plain as the lamp between us. I told him I understood. I told him I'd pray on it. He left, and I sat at the table and I looked at the Bible and I didn't open it. That was the night I set it down. I want to be honest about what the next year looked like, because it was not a good year and I'm not going to dress it up. I worked at the livery, mucking stalls, mostly. It was honest work and I am not ashamed of it, but I had been a man people asked for guidance. I had sat with dying men and grieving widows and scared young couples about to start their lives, and I had had something to give them. I didn't have that anymore. I didn't know what I believed and I didn't want to pretend, so I kept my mouth shut and the silence got heavy. I drank some, not so much that I was a drunk, but more than I should. At the Miners' Rest mostly, because the Miners' Rest was a rough place where no one from the congregation went, which was exactly why I liked it. That's where I first saw her. Her name was Delia Marsh. She'd come to Harlan Creek from El Paso at the end of that summer on the stage, alone, with a trunk that wasn't large. She'd gone to work at Lupe's place. Guadalupe Riene ran a house on the south end of town, 2 blocks past the church, which was a location the congregation had opinions about but had never managed to change. Lupe's girls were known to the men of the town in the way that those girls are known, acknowledged privately, ignored publicly. I knew Delia by sight before I knew her name. Small woman, dark hair pinned back plain, nothing decorative about it. A face that had been pretty in a way that some hardship had gotten into, not destroyed, just changed. She had a stillness about her. She didn't perform in the way some women in her situation perform, no artificial brightness, no working of a room. She did her work and she walked through the town with her eyes straight and her chin level, and if anyone stared, she didn't look away first. I respected that before I'd said 2 words to her. I respected that and I told myself that's all it was. The first time we actually talked was at the dry goods store in February of 1888. I was buying salt and she was buying thread. That is the whole setup, salt and thread. A Tuesday morning, nobody else in the store but old man Hirsch behind the counter who barely looked up. She said, "You're the deacon." I said, "Was." She looked at me a moment with those steady eyes, and she said, "Seems like the kind of thing that doesn't wash off." I didn't know what she meant by that, and I still don't entirely, but I said, "Sometimes it just wears down." She nodded, paid for a thread, walked out. I thought about that exchange for the rest of the week. I thought about it more than I should have. What struck me was that she hadn't meant it as a cruelty, wasn't rubbing my nose in what I'd lost. And she hadn't meant it as false comfort either. She just said a plain thing that happened to be true, the way you'd say it to someone you figured could hear it. Most people weren't saying plain things to me anymore. Most people were either sorry for me or had decided I was a fool, and both of those things came with a kind of soft handling that I hated. I started going to the dry goods store on Tuesday mornings. That's not something I'm proud of either, if I'm being honest. She probably knew. She kept buying thread on Tuesdays anyway. By March we were talking regularly, though not in any place anyone would see us together, at the dry goods counter. Once at the edge of the livery pasture where she sometimes walked in the evening, she told me later the horses settled her, and I understood that. We talked about nothing extraordinary. The weather, the quality of the road south, whether the new Assyr was better than the old one. She'd lived in 3 different territories, and she had opinions about all of them, expressed clearly and without apology. I did not ask her about Lupe's. She did not offer. We both understood what her life was, and neither of us made a performance of ignoring it. What I noticed was this: she listened to me. Not with the nodding patience of a person waiting for you to finish, but the kind of listening where you can feel it, where the other person is actually tracking what you say, weighing it, prepared to disagree. When she disagreed, she said so directly. When she thought I was wrong about something, she told me. She had no reason to flatter me. She wasn't trying to get anything from me. She was just talking to me like I was a man worth talking to. I hadn't felt that in over a year. One evening at the pasture fence, she said, "What are you going to do about the church?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "That's not really nothing, that's a decision." I stood there with my hands on the top rail, and the horses moving slow in the last light, and I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "I don't know what I believe anymore." She said, "That's not the same as not believing anything." I looked at her. She was looking out at the horses, profile to me, and there was nothing in her face that said she was trying to fix me or redirect me. She was just saying what was true. I thought about that for a long time. In April, 3 things happened close together. The first was that Reverend Ellis announced a building fund for a new wing on the church. A fellowship hall, he called it, a place for the congregation to gather and break bread together. He asked for names of people who might sit on a planning committee. Aldous Fenn came to see me the next morning. He said Ellis had mentioned my name. He said some people in the congregation, not all of them, but some, felt that enough time had passed and that a man being humbled and getting back up was actually a good kind of example. He said he was just passing it along, no pressure, take it for what it was. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no. I said I'd think about it. The second thing was that Lupe Riene came to me at the livery. I knew Lupe, most everyone did. She was a businesswoman, sharp, not cruel, ran her house with rules that most places didn't have. She sat down on a hay bale and she said she needed to talk to me about Delia. She said Delia was sick. Not a fever, not a cough. Something else, something that had been building since before El Paso, maybe longer. Lupe didn't know exactly what it was, but she knew Delia needed to stop working, needed rest, needed food that was better than what they had at the house, and she couldn't provide all of that. She said Delia had no family she knew of. She said Delia had kept her own counsel about it, and Lupe had only noticed because she was sharp-eyed and had seen it getting worse. She said she wasn't sure who else to tell. I asked why she was telling me. Lupe said, "Because you're the only person in this town who's talked to her like she's a person." I sat with that for a moment, then I asked if I could go see her. The third thing happened 2 days later. I went to Lupe's house in the middle of the afternoon when the street was quiet, and I knocked on the door like a man visiting a sick neighbor, which I suppose I was. Lupe let me in without comment. Delia was in a back room, sitting up in a plain iron bed, and she looked worse than I'd expected. She'd lost weight. Her color was wrong. She had a book open in her lap, a geography of the Western Territories, of all things, and she looked up when I came in with that same level expression, not embarrassed, not performing gratitude. She said, "I told Lupe not to tell anyone." I said, "She didn't tell anyone, she told me." She was quiet a moment, then same thing. I sat down on the chair by the wall and I said, "Not entirely." She looked at me for a long time. I held the look. I said, "I'd like to help if you'll let me. I'm not trying to save you. I think you should have somewhere better to be while you get your strength back. I've got an empty house." She said, "People will talk." I said, "People already talk. I've been a story in this town for a year. One more chapter won't kill either of us." Something changed in her face. Not a smile exactly, something quieter than a smile. She looked down at the geography book in her lap and she was still for a while and then she said, "All right." I moved her into the house on a Friday. I carried her trunk myself from Lupe's to my place, 4 blocks through the center of Harlan Creek, middle of the afternoon, with the trunk on my shoulder and Delia walking beside me. I was not going to sneak. I had sneaked enough in the past year. I'd sneaked away from the church, sneaked away from who I'd been, sneaked my way into the Miner's Rest every night like a man ashamed of his own thirst. I was done sneaking. People stared. A woman outside the millinery stopped and stared with her hand flat on the glass. 2 men in front of the barbers turned and watched. I kept walking. Delia kept walking. I gave her the back room, my bedroom, because it had the better window and more light. I moved my things to the front room. I bought a cot from the dry goods store. I bought a chicken from a woman who kept them on the South Road, and I made a broth that wasn't very good but was hot, and Delia ate it without complaint. She slept most of the first week. I went to work at the livery and came home and made whatever I could make and left it for her. In the evening, she'd come out to the table and eat a little, and sometimes we'd talk and sometimes we didn't. She didn't ask for anything, and she thanked me without overdoing it, which I appreciated. She had that quality. She could receive something without making it bigger than it was, without performing the reception. She just took it and acknowledged it and moved on. I started reading again in those evenings. Not the Bible, not yet, just reading. I had a few books, a history of the territory that I'd never gotten through, a battered almanac. She had her geography. Sometimes we read on opposite sides of the table with the lamp between us and didn't talk for an hour, and it was the most peaceful I'd been in a long time. The congregation came to see me about 2 weeks in. Not Reverend Ellis. He sent Aldous Fenn again with Harriet Cole, who was the head of the Women's Society and had been a Leaner's friend. They sat at my kitchen table with their hats in their laps, and they were not unkind about it. Harriet said that the situation was causing comment. Aldous said it was the nature of the woman that was the trouble, not me showing charity, that if it had been any other woman, people would have admired it. Harriet said the planning committee was still open, and they still thought I'd be good on it, but that this current arrangement made things complicated. I listened to all of it. I gave them coffee. I told them I heard what they were saying. Then I said, "She's sick and she's alone and I have an empty house and a spare room. That's what's happening here. If the congregation needs more than that to understand it, I'm not sure what else I can tell them." Harriet said, "Caleb, we know your intentions. It's the appearance." I said, "The appearance is a woman who needed help and got it. If that's the wrong appearance, I don't know what the right one looks like." Aldous looked at his hat for a moment. Then he said, "The planning committee." I said, "I appreciate you thinking of me. I'll let you know." They left. Delia was in the back room. She'd heard everything. The walls weren't thick. When I went in to see if she wanted supper, she was sitting with the geography book, and she said, without looking up, "You didn't have to do that." I said, "Do what?" She said, "Choose." I said, "I didn't choose anything. I told them what was true." She looked up at me then with those dark eyes, and there was something in them I hadn't seen before, something that looked like it might be pain, but not the ordinary kind. The kind that comes when someone does a thing for you that you didn't believe they would do. She didn't say anything else. I went and made supper. She got better slowly, over 6 weeks. The color came back. She started eating the way a person should eat. She started getting up earlier, and by the 5th week she was up before me, had the stove lit, had coffee going, which I told her she didn't need to do, and she told me she didn't do it for me. She did it because she liked mornings, and I didn't argue. We talked more, real talk, the kind that goes somewhere. She told me about El Paso, about the town before that which was in Colorado, about a father who'd been a school teacher and a mother who died when she was 11, and a series of things after that which I won't go into because they're hers, not mine to tell. She didn't tell it as tragedy, that's what I mean. She told it as fact. This happened, then this, then this. She'd made her choices, not all of them good, she knew that, and she'd lived with them without drowning in them. That was something I hadn't managed. One evening I told her about the mine. I hadn't told the whole of it to anyone, just the parts people already knew. But I told her all of it, including the part where I knew in my gut that the second stake was foolish and did it anyway, and the part where the vein thinned and I wanted Fewett to be right so badly I'd stopped thinking clearly, and the part at the end when I sat at the kitchen table and couldn't open the Bible and didn't know why. She listened to the whole thing, then she said, "What do you think you were actually looking for?" I said, "Money, a way out of being alone." She said, "That sounds right." I said, "I'm not sure I believe in anything anymore." She said, "You believe in honest work. You believe in a sick person deserving a warm room. You believe in not sneaking. You've shown me those things." She paused. "That's more than a lot of men who stand up in front of a congregation." The lamp was low and the night was cold, and she said it without any softness in her voice, just plain, the way she said everything. Like she'd weighed it and found it accurate and saw no reason not to say so. I sat with that for a long time. In June, she told me she was going to leave. She said it at the table, mourning, matter of fact. She said she was well enough now. She said she didn't want to impose further. She said she'd written to a woman she knew in Tucson who had a boarding house there, and she thought she'd go down and start over in a place where nobody knew her, and that was probably the right move. I listened to her say it. I waited until she was done. Then I said, "I don't want you to go." She looked at me. I said, "I'm telling you that plainly because I'm done not saying things. You've been the only person in this town who talked to me like I was still worth talking to. When you're here, the house is different. I'm different. I don't know what you want or what you think of me, and if you want to go to Tucson, I won't stop you, but I'd be lying if I didn't say that." She was quiet for a long time. She looked at her coffee cup. She turned it in her hands the way she did sometimes, just rotating it slowly, thinking. Then she said, "Nobody's going to marry a woman who's done what I've done." I said, "I'm aware of what I am. An out-of-work deacon who got robbed by a mule salesman and can barely pay for his own coffee. I'm not exactly a prize either." Something almost like a smile, she looked up. I said, "I'm asking you to marry me." She said, "The church won't perform it." I said, "I know." She said, "The town will have opinions." I said, "The town already has opinions." She set the coffee cup down very precisely in the center of the table, and she looked at me for a long time, and I looked back at her. The morning light was coming through the east window, and it was on the side of her face, and she looked tired and plain and more real to me than anything I'd seen in years. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because you're the best person I know, and because I think you've earned a place to be, same as anyone." She was quiet for a while, then she said, "All right. I should tell you about the wedding, even though it wasn't much." Reverend Ellis declined. We expected that. The Baptist minister also declined. The Catholic priest in Cruces said he'd pray for us, and that was all. We rode down to Cruces on a Friday morning with Aldous Fenn, who was the only person from the congregation who'd said he'd stand with us. And we were married by a justice of the peace in a small office that smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool. Delia wore a dark blue dress. I wore my good coat. Aldous wore his regular clothes and fidgeted the whole time, but he was there, which was the thing that mattered. The justice of the peace read the words. I said them. She said them. He stamped the paper. We rode back to Harlan Creek in the late afternoon, the three of us, with the sun behind us and the dust coming off the road, and Aldous talking about what needed doing at his brother's place in a way that I think was his version of celebrating. When we got back to the house, Delia stood on the step for a moment. She looked at the door like she was figuring out what it was now. Then she opened it and went in. I stood outside for a minute. The street was empty. The church was 3 blocks north, and I could see the steeple against the sky, white, going pale gold in the evening. I thought about the Bible on the table. I went inside. I won't tell you the congregation came around because they didn't, not most of them. Harriet Cole stopped speaking to me for 2 years. Reverend Ellis was civil when we passed on the street. Nothing more. The planning committee went ahead without me, and they built their fellowship hall, and it was a fine hall by all accounts. But some things changed. They changed slowly and without announcement, which is usually how the real changes go. Walt Cribbs, who'd lost his feed store and had to take it back from the bank slowly over 3 years, came to me in the fall and asked me to ride out to the alderman's place with him. The aldermans were a family whose eldest son had come back from a range job badly injured, something with a horse, and Walt thought they needed someone to talk to, and he didn't know what to say. I went. I didn't preach at them. I sat with the father, and I helped him think through what needed doing practically, and before I left I said a prayer with him, which surprised me somewhat, because I hadn't done that in nearly 2 years. The words came, and they felt honest. I told Delia about it that evening. She said, "Did it help them?" I said, "I think so." She said, "Then it was the right thing." That was how she was. She didn't make more of something than it was. She didn't tell me what it meant or what I should do with it. She just identified whether a thing was useful and said so, and left me to draw my own conclusions. I started going back to the church occasionally. Not every Sunday, I'm still not every Sunday, but when something happened in town that seemed to need it, or when I found myself standing at the edge of something I used to know and feeling like I might want to step back into it. Ellis never brought up restoring my position. I never asked about it. I don't know if I'd want it back exactly as it was. But I opened the Bible again, not that winter, the winter after. I'd been reading a passage from the Gospel of Mark that I used to read with a dying man, and I'd wanted to look something up, and I sat down and opened it and read for a while, and it was all right. It wasn't the same as it used to be, but it was all right. There's something I need to tell you about Delia that I've been getting to. I told you she got better. That was true. What I didn't tell you was that she didn't get fully well, not in the way you want a person to get well. She was stronger than when she'd arrived, and for 4 or 5 years she was fine, mostly. She had seasons where she struggled more. Her constitution wasn't what it should have been, and she knew it, and I knew it, and we didn't talk about it excessively. She ran the house. She kept a kitchen garden, the best one on the street, tomatoes, squash, a few short rows of corn that mostly succeeded. She got to know the women who came to buy eggs from the Reinhold place at the edge of town, and a few of them became something close to friends, the kind of friends who don't make a ceremony of it, just show up and help with a heavy thing and leave without making you feel obliged. She read everything she could get her hands on. She borrowed books from the school library. The teacher was a young woman from Ohio who had no opinions about what anyone had done before she arrived, which was one of the things I liked about her. Delia worked through that geography of the Western Territories 3 times, and then started on a natural history of the Great Plains, and an account of the Lewis and Clark expedition that kept her occupied for most of a winter. What I want to tell you is what she was like on a regular day, not in a crisis, not at a turning point, just a regular day. She was up before me most mornings, coffee made, stove warm. She'd be at the table with a book or writing something in the journal she kept, and when I came in she'd look up and there was a look she had, not a greeting exactly, more like an acknowledgement. Like I'd walked into a room and she was glad of it without needing to say so. I don't know how to describe that look better than that. It wasn't romantic performance. It was just the way you look at someone whose presence is good. We didn't have a lot of money. We didn't need a lot of money. The livery paid decently, and in time I started doing some occasional work, not preaching, but things adjacent. Sitting with the sick, helping families think through hard situations, the kind of work nobody had an official title for, but that needed doing. A few people started paying me a little for it, and I let them. The mine was done. I had lost my savings and my standing and a year and a half of my life, and I wasn't going to get any of that back. I knew that. It just stopped mattering the way it used to matter. Some losses you carry and they weigh you down, and other losses you carry and eventually they just become part of the weight of you, which is different. I'm getting to the end of what I have to tell you. Delia died in April of 1896. It was not sudden and it was not unexpected, and I was with her. She went the way people go when they've been ill for a long time, not with drama, just a gradual letting go over 3 days, and then she was gone. I am not going to tell you that story in full because it is not the story I set out to tell you, and because there are parts of it that are mine alone. What I'll tell you is this. On the second day, when she was still conscious but weak, I was sitting beside the bed with her hand in mine, and I said, "You didn't have to stay." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "When I asked you to stay, when I asked you to marry me, you didn't have to, you were well enough to leave, you had Tucson. You could have gone." She was quiet for a moment. She had the blanket pulled up to her chin, and her eyes were open, and they were still level, still steady, the same as the first day I'd seen them. She said, "I know." I said, "Why did you?" She turned her head toward me. She looked at me the way she'd always looked at me, like I was worth looking at. Like she was seeing what was actually there and finding it sufficient. She said, "Because you walked 4 blocks through town with my trunk on your shoulder in broad daylight, and you didn't look down once." I sat with that. She said, "And because you needed someone and you didn't know how to ask, and you asked anyway." I looked at her, her hand was thin in mine. Her eyes were tired but clear. She said, "I'd been in enough places where the men decided what I was worth. You showed me, and I decided I wasn't going anywhere. I don't have a clean way to tell you what that meant to me. I'm not going to try." She died the following afternoon. The Bible is still on the table. I open it now, not every day, more than I used to. Reverend Ellis retired in 1897, and the congregation brought in a younger man from Kansas who knew nothing about any of it. And on the first Sunday he was in the pulpit, I went to church for the first time in 9 years and sat in the 3rd pew and didn't think about anything in particular. He was a decent preacher. Green, but decent. He came and shook my hand after the service and asked if I'd consider helping with some of the pastoral work, the sitting with people work, and I said I'd think on it. I thought on it. I said yes. There is a photograph of Delia and me that Aldous Fenn's wife took in 1893 on the occasion of our 5th year. I am standing beside her on the front step, and I have my hand at the small of her back, and she is looking at the camera with that level look, and I am looking at her. I don't know that I plan to look at her instead of the camera. I just did. I look at that photograph sometimes. I don't think she saved me in the way that stories usually tell it. I don't think I was falling and she caught me. I think what she did was simpler and harder than that. She just kept telling me what was true. She kept treating me like a man worth telling the truth to, even when I wasn't sure I was, and after a while I started to believe it again. That's what I have to tell you. That's all of it. The coffee tin is still under the bed, too. Empty. I keep it for the same reason I keep the Bible on the table and the photograph on the shelf, not to remind myself of what I lost. To remind myself what I had at the end of it.